Here's a fun little fact that the government would very much prefer you didn't dwell on. Back in 2017, a certain shadow Brexit secretary stood up in Parliament and declared that a proposed bill gave, and we're paraphrasing only slightly, sweeping, unchecked powers to the executive to change regulations without proper parliamentary scrutiny. He called it dangerous. He called it undemocratic. He called it a threat to hard-won rights. That man was Keir Starmer. Fast forward to today, and Keir Starmer is now Prime Minister, and his government is planning legislation to automatically align the UK with future EU single market rules, without normal parliamentary scrutiny. The irony is so thick you could serve it at a Brussels summit with a side of croissants. Let's get into what's actually happening here, because this story is more significant than most people realize, and it's moving fast. Ministers are set to introduce legislation to align the UK with future Brussels-derived regulations without the normal parliamentary scrutiny you'd expect for something this consequential. The legislation is expected to land in May's King's Speech as part of what Starmer's team has been branding the EU reset, a grand diplomatic repositioning that, depending on your perspective, is either a sensible economic repair job or the slow-motion reversal of the biggest democratic vote in British history. Take your pick. There's no neutral seat in this particular theater. Now, you might ask, how exactly do you change laws that flow from an international agreement without letting Parliament properly debate them? The answer lies in something called Henry VIII powers. And yes, that's exactly as dramatic as it sounds. Named after the Statute of Proclamations of 1539, which allowed Henry to overrule Parliament with a swift flick of the quill, these powers let ministers write secondary legislation that, in effect, amends or repeals primary laws, all without going through the full parliamentary process. So you get new rules, new obligations, new regulatory alignments, and MPs essentially get handed the finished product and asked to rubber stamp it, rather than debate it line by line at the dispatch box. That is the mechanism being proposed here. Henry VIII, a man who famously did whatever he wanted, bypassed all institutional opposition, and thought he was absolutely right about everything at all times. You can see why politicians keep reaching for his toolkit. And here's where it gets really pointed. A government source has insisted that Parliament will have a role for new deals and on new EU laws applying under those deals. But what's understood is that MPs will retain the ability to rubber stamp new deals, rather than debate and vote on all new directives. Rubber stamp. That's the actual word floating around Westminster. Parliament, one of the oldest deliberative bodies in the world, reduced to a stamp. You might as well install a printer and send the MPs home early. The government's defense, to be fair, is not nothing. A spokesman pointed to a food and drink trade deal worth £5.1 billion a year, which they say will back British jobs and slash costly red tape for farmers, producers, and businesses. And look, cheaper food, less bureaucracy at the border, smoother trade. Those are genuinely attractive outcomes that affect real people's weekly shopping bills. Nobody is pretending the post-Brexit trading arrangements have been seamless. They haven't been. But the question isn't whether trade with the EU matters. Of course it does. The question is whether you get to rule-line regulatory frameworks with Brussels in perpetuity through secondary legislation, without giving the people's elected representatives a meaningful vote every single time new rules come down from Brussels. Those are very different things, and conflating them is exactly what governments do when they want to avoid answering the harder question. Nigel Farage was unambiguous, calling the plans a backdoor attempt to drag Britain back under EU control and describing accepting EU rules without a vote as a direct betrayal of the Brexit referendum and a total breach of the government's manifesto promises. That's the reform line. And it's a line that will land with an enormous number of people who voted Leave in 2016 and feel they've been watching that result get slowly chipped away ever since. Shadow Business Secretary Andrew Griffith piled in, saying Labour are still fighting the referendum because they fundamentally cannot accept the democratic decision the British people made. Now, the government will say that's hyperbole, that the parliamentary role is real, that the economic gains are tangible. And those debates will run and run. But here's the thing about the Henry VIII framing that nobody seems to want to address directly. It's not just about this bill. It's about the precedent. Once you establish that a government can bind the UK to evolving EU regulations via secondary legislation, regulations written in Brussels, debated in the European Parliament, voted on by MEPs, you've created a dynamic that doesn't have an obvious off switch. The EU doesn't stand still. It produces directives continuously. And if the mechanism says the UK aligns automatically, with Parliament waving it through rather than scrutinizing it, you've effectively created a rule-taker arrangement. Not membership, not the single market, but rule-taking, which is exactly what the Leave campaign said was the worst possible outcome, and which Keir Starmer, as Shadow Brexit Secretary, said was unacceptable when the Tories tried it. The political timing is also worth noting. Alongside this, reports have emerged that the EU is demanding the UK pay significant sums to join its energy grid and hand over control of output as part of Starmer's reset, a revelation that critics have described as a Chagar-style surrender of strategic infrastructure. Energy independence, parliamentary sovereignty, and trade alignment all on the table at once, with the May local elections bearing down and Reform polling strongly on exactly these issues. Whatever your view on Brexit, and people hold very different ones, the principle of who decides what laws govern Britain and whether Parliament gets a genuine say in that is not a left or right issue. It's a constitutional one, and constitutions, like old monarchs, have a habit of being a lot harder to reclaim once you've given the power away. Stay with British Reform for every twist of this story as it develops. Subscribe, hit the bell, and make sure you're the first to know when the next shoe drops.